In October 1957, a small metal sphere the size of a beach ball changed the world. Sputnik beeped as it crossed the night sky, and with that sound, the Soviet Union appeared unstoppable. The common story goes like this. The USSR dominated the early space race, humiliated the United States, and proved socialism could out-innovate capitalism. Space was a victory lap, a triumph, a symbol of strength. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the very program that made the Soviet Union look powerful was quietly bleeding it dry? What if the space race didn't just challenge American pride, but slowly hollowed out the Soviet economy from the inside? No dramatic collapse, no single fatal decision, just decades of hidden costs, distorted incentives, and economic pressure that most people never see when they look at rockets and cosmonauts. Tonight, we're not asking who won the space race. We're asking a far more uncomfortable question. Did the space race help bankrupt the Soviet Union long before it officially collapsed? And if it did, why did no one stop it? To understand how space exploration could quietly damage a superpower, we have to rewind not to rockets, but to economics. After World War II, the world split into two competing systems. On one side, the United States, a capitalist economy fueled by private industry, consumer markets, and profit signals. On the other, the Soviet Union, a centrally planned economy where the state decided what to build, how much to produce, and where resources went. This difference mattered enormously in the US. Military and space spending still competed with civilian demand. Politicians had to justify budgets. Companies could fail. Costs mattered. In the Soviet system, however, political prestige often overruled economic efficiency. If the Communist Party declared something a priority, steel tanks or rockets resources would be diverted regardless of cost. And nothing carried more prestige during the Cold War than space. The space wasn't just science. It was ideology made visible. Every satellite launch was proof, at least symbolically, that socialism could outpace capitalism. Every cosmonaut was a walking propaganda victory. And that incentive structure would quietly shape decisions for decades. The space race didn't begin as a dream of exploration. It began as a military problem. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, both the US and the USSR were racing to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of delivering nuclear warheads across the globe. Rockets were not about the moon, they were about survival. Whoever mastered long-range missile technology first would hold a terrifying strategic advantage. For the Soviet Union, rockets had another appeal. They were a way to compensate for economic weaknesses. The USSR lagged behind the US in consumer goods, productivity, and living standards. But in heavy industry and military hardware, it could concentrate massive resources. Rockets fit perfectly. So when Sergei Korolev, called the father of the Soviet space program, pushed for satellite launches, the leadership listened. Not because they cared about science, but because space success could demonstrate missile capability without firing a weapon. Sputnik was not just a satellite. It was a message. Sputnik's success shocked the world and terrified Washington. But inside the Soviet Union, something equally important happened. Space became untouchable. Budgets were approved without scrutiny. Failures were hidden. Costs were classified. Unlike consumer industries, space projects didn't have to pay off. Their value was political, not economic. This created a dangerous illusion. The USSR appeared to be winning, while quietly losing efficiency. Each new milestone, first man in space, first woman, first spacewalk, required increasingly complex systems, more engineers, more materials, and more factories. But instead of replacing outdated infrastructure or improving productivity, the Soviet state layered space spending on top of existing inefficiencies. Resources were pulled from agriculture, housing, transportation, and consumer manufacturing. And because the economy was centrally planned, there were no price signals to reveal the damage. Shortages didn't show up as losses on a balance sheet. They showed up as empty shelves. Here's where the space race diverged economically. The United States also spent enormous sums, but it had three critical advantages. 1. Private contractors. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and North American Aviation competed for contracts, absorbed risk, and developed technologies that later spilled into civilian markets. 2. Dual-use innovation. Microelectronics, computing, materials science, many space technologies eventually boosted productivity across the economy. 3. Economic elasticity. The US economy was large, flexible, and consumption. Space spending was painful but survivable. The Soviet Union had none of this. Its space industry was isolated, secretive, and militarized. Technologies developed for rockets rarely reached civilian use. Factories building spacecraft didn't improve washing machines, cars, or food production. Instead of spillover benefits, the USSR got resource black holes. Entire research cities were built that produced prestige but little economic return. The most dangerous cost wasn't what the USSR long-duration space stations, military orbital platforms, redundant launch systems, classified space weapons concepts these projects consumed. Highly skilled engineers, rare materials, entire production chains. But none of them fixed the economy. The space sector had become politically protected, immune to cost-benefit analysis. At the same time, oil revenues masked the damage. During the 1970s, rising energy prices temporarily filled state coffers, allowing the USSR to fund both social programs and prestige spending. This created a dangerous illusion. The system looked stable, but it wasn't resilient. When energy prices fell in the 1980s, the illusion shattered. By the Brezhnev era, the Soviet economy had entered what historians call the era of stagnation. Growth slowed, productivity flattened, innovation dried up. But here's the critical link to space. The most talented engineers were locked inside military and aerospace projects that produced no consumer value. The best materials were reserved for rockets, not housing. The best factories built launch vehicles while civilian industry rusted. This was not accidental. The command economy rewarded loyalty and secrecy, not efficiency, and space programs were the most secretive of all. Meanwhile, everyday Soviets felt the decline. Long food lines, poor quality goods, decaying infrastructure. A system that could put a man in orbit couldn't reliably put meat on shelves. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the mid-1980s, he understood something was wrong. His reforms, perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost openness were attempts to fix deep structural problems. But the space and military sectors were nearly untouchable. They employed millions. They symbolized superpower status. They were intertwined with national security. Cutting them risked collapse. Not cutting them guaranteed it. This was the paradox. Gorbachev tried to reduce military spending, but resistance from entrenched interests slowed everything. Meanwhile, the economy deteriorated faster than reforms could stabilize it. Space had become too big to sustain and too symbolic to abandon. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it wasn't because rockets stopped launching. In fact, Soviet space expertise survived and the engineers later worked with NASA or private firms. The collapse happened because the economic base was exhausted. Decades of prestige-first spending had left. Obsolete factories, massive hidden debt. A population disconnected from the state's priorities. The space race didn't cause the collapse alone, but it magnified every weakness. It rewarded image over efficiency, secrecy over feedback, short-term glory over long-term sustainability. This story isn't just about the Cold War. It's about how great powers overspend to maintain dominance. Today, nations race in artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, space militarization, semiconductor supremacy. Trillions are being spent not always for economic return, but for strategic signaling. The pattern is familiar. 1. Prestige projects gain political protection. 2. Costs become opaque. 3. Opportunity costs are ignored. 4. Structural weaknesses grow unseen. The Soviet Union shows what happens when symbolic power replaces economic health. 1. Prestige is not productivity. Spectacular achievements can hide economic decay. 2. Opportunity cost is the silent killer. What you don't invest in matters more than what you do. 3. Systems without feedback collapse slowly then suddenly. Without price signals or accountability, mistakes compound invisibly. The space race made the Soviet Union look unstoppable. But strength that cannot feed, house, or sustain its people is not strength at all. The most dangerous failures aren't dramatic. They're quiet, and by the time they're visible, it's already too late. If this changed how you see the space race and modern power politics, like the video so it reaches more curious minds. Subscribe for deep dive documentaries on hidden economic history, and comment below. Are today's tech and space racers repeating the same mistake, or have we learned the lesson?